Hello, government people. Um, week 6 of online instruction, week 8 of not seeing each other. I hope everybody's doing well. And always remember, if you need anything, let me know. So this week, this is the final branch of government for us to review, basically a third time. We first did the legislative branch, then the executive branch, and today, or for this video, it's going to be the judicial branch. So once again, like I've said for the previous 2 weeks, you could probably take this quiz and do just fine, pass it, master it, without even going through the tutorial. However, I encourage you to go through the tutorial and take notes, go over everything, read everything closely to make sure you understand it and you can do your best. The better you do well, I would say the more you focus on doing well in the tutorial, the easier the mastery test is going to be. So I'm going to share my screen here. Hopefully it'll work, and then we can get through this lesson. All right, so the judicial branch. Today, your objective is to, you're going to examine the structure and powers of the judicial branch and be able to describe and explain those powers in your own words. Many of those you can probably do already. So when you think of the judicial system, you probably think going to court. Hopefully, not many of you have been to court. I hope that stays that way for the remainder of your lives. Follow the law, especially our stay-at-home orders. Alrighty, so the fifth slide, basically, it's talking about all of these things here, all the bullet points. Those are the things that the federal, or I would say the federal courts have jurisdiction, and we'll talk about what jurisdiction means here in a few slides. But all of these things, federal courts deal with. If it's not one of these things, it's going to be a state court. Right? And state courts are set up in the same way, but they're not as, I don't know, federal courts are a bigger deal, right? They're supreme. So laws, treaties related in the Constitution of the United States, those are dealt with by federal courts, such as the Supreme Court. Diplomatic representatives from other countries, laws related to the sea or shipping, because once again, those probably go between states, interstate. That's a federal issue there. 2 or more state governments, citizens of different states, right? State versus state. Those issues are going to be solved or dealt with by federal courts, particularly the Supreme Court. All right, so that's what they deal with. This is the Judiciary Act of 1789. We've talked about that before because it has to deal with Marbury versus Madison, which basically created the judicial review principle that we talked so much about. So basically, this Judiciary Act of 1789, it created a 3-tiered federal court system where you have district courts, which are the lowest level. Then you go to the circuit courts. Circuit courts are where you appeal the original verdict of your case, or you can't appeal it. And then the highest level is the Supreme Court. And that is true. That 3-tier system is at the federal level and at state level, okay? Because we have a federal Supreme Court, but we also have a state Supreme Court. That federalist system that we talked about such a long time ago. So judicial review. I'm not going to talk very much about this because you should all know what this is. This is the main power that the judicial branch has. The Supreme Court has this power. They look at all laws and actions by the legislative branch, executive branch, every branch of government to see if their actions or what they do corresponds or contradicts the Constitution. If it corresponds and it agrees with the Constitution, it's okay. Everything's hunky-dory. However, if somebody's action violates or goes against the Constitution, the Supreme Court can rule that unconstitutional, meaning that it's basically illegal, right? It violated the Constitution. That is their most important role to play within the check and balance system, judicial review. So Marbury versus Madison, I encourage you to read all this. I'm going to do a brief synopsis here. Talked about this in class as well. So first off, judicial review is not outlined in the Constitution. Our founding fathers did not pencil it into Article 3 of the Constitution, which deals with the judicial branch. It's an inherent power, and it comes out of Chief Justice John Marshall. His decision in Marbury versus Madison created the idea of judicial review, which we still use today. Okay, so we're going to go along here. I think there's another slide. So slide 10 has the verdict, basically. So John Marshall, the Judicial Act of 1789, basically said that the Supreme Court could issue writs of mandamus, which basically means if the Supreme Court issues a writ of mandamus to you, you have to do whatever they tell you to do. So they're mandating you do something. Basically, James Madison, who was it? No, John. Marbury wanted the Supreme Court to issue a writ of mandamus to Madison, who was James Madison, who was Secretary of State for Thomas Jefferson. Basically, because as John Adams was leaving the presidency and Thomas Jefferson was coming in, Adams appointed Marbury as a judge. All right, Thomas Jefferson and Madison did not like Marbury because he was a political opponent. So Jefferson told Madison not to approve his judge position. Basically, Marbury sued or challenged that, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. John Marshall, Chief Justice, said that it was unconstitutional for the Supreme Court to be able to mandate people do things like that. So basically, he said that the Judiciary Act, or parts of the Judiciary Act of 1789, were unconstitutional. The writ of mandamus was unconstitutional. So that's where judicial review came from. All right, boom. All right, done with that. All right, Supreme Court building, not much I want to talk about here. It was built in the 1930s during the Works Project when FDR was trying to get our economy back. They were hiring people to build a lot of things around the country. This was one of the buildings, and it solidified the judicial branch as the third branch of government. It is directly across the street and it faces the United States Capitol building, where the legislative branch does all their stuff at. All right, slide 13 is a good video I encourage you to listen to and watch about the Supreme Court building. All right, so the U.S. legal system. It's essentially a very complex structure of federal courts, state courts, local courts, and they all have different responsibilities. So it's pretty confusing. So the key here is to take your time and read through this. And don't rush through and think you know it, because even for me, it's confusing, right? It's very technical, right? I'm not a lawyer. You guys aren't lawyers, so we're not pros at this stuff, all right? So just read through it and you should do just fine. All right, so that's basically all that says. And we'll talk about jurisdiction and precedent here coming up. So jurisdiction, this basically means, does a court have the authority to interpret and apply a law in a given situation? So not all courts have the same responsibilities, okay? And that's important to understand. There's criminal courts, civil courts, you have federal courts, state courts. There's a bunch of, you have legislative courts. There's a bunch of different types of courts. So there's two types of jurisdiction, right? So jurisdiction, remember, is the ability or the authority of a court to hear an issue, all right, or hear a case. So you have, the first is when the court, we're on slide 15 here, when the court that tries a case for the first time, right? So if a court tries a case for the first time, it's called original jurisdiction. Original should mean like the first. So original jurisdiction is when a court tries something or hears a case for the first time, all right? The losing party in that case has the ability to appeal or challenge that ruling to a higher court. So then that higher court has the jurisdiction of appellate, which is spelled Appellate, appellate jurisdiction. So when you appeal something, it goes to the next court. The court that hears that appeal has appellate jurisdiction. An appeals court, an appellate court, can never have original jurisdiction because they're hearing it for the second time, not the first time. All right. So you start with original jurisdiction the first time. If it is appealed, the losing party chooses to appeal, it goes to the appellate court, which would be circuit courts. Right. So the federal judiciary now holds exclusive jurisdiction over certain areas of law, which means so the federal judiciary, this isn't state, federal courts, let's see, they gave some examples here. They have jurisdiction over cases involving a federal or foreign official, so like a foreign spy or something, acts of Congress, so laws passed by Congress, violation of federal criminal law, and the Supreme Court may decide disputes between two states. So those examples are things that are going to be under federal judiciary jurisdiction. All right, so those are federal matters. Right, if you break a federal law, that's going to be in a federal court. You're going to have to show up and see your day in court. But there's also concurrent. So if you rob a federally backed bank in Ohio, you're going to be prosecuted by the state of Ohio, but you're also going to be prosecuted by the federal government. So that's a concurrent jurisdiction. Concurrent jurisdiction is when the state and federal levels work together. All right, state, federal levels work together in concurrent jurisdiction. So if you rob a federally backed bank in Ohio, you're breaking Ohio law and you're also breaking federal law. Criminal law, this is, when you think about courts and law, this is what you're going to be thinking about most of the time. This is when you have, like, these are crimes against society. So murder, that's a criminal law, right? That's breaking the law in every state. Vandalism also, that would be a misdemeanor, but that would be an example. Tired. Criminal cases usually result in you're being arrested by the police for a crime, which can be a misdemeanor all the way to a felony. You have trial by jury in these instances, which use the grand jury and the Petit Jury, which we'll talk about a little later. All right, and remember the Bill of Rights, Fifth Amendment, Sixth Amendment, Eighth Amendment, all of these protect you. All right. I hope you remember all those details. All right, so civil law is different from criminal law. Civil law basically is when someone sues another person. All right, so let's say someone backs into my car, they don't want to pay, they won't give their insurance, so I choose to sue them. That would be civil, right? There might not be a law broken, there might have been some kind of damage or a contract broken. That's going to be a lawsuit. All right. So those Judge Judy, all that stuff, when people are suing each other, that is civil law. It's between two people. Okay. And lastly, constitutional law deals with the Constitution. This is the most important type of law because the Constitution is the law of the land. All right. That should be obvious. So whatever is decided on that holds a lot of weight and has to apply to the 300 and some million people in America. So those should be taken seriously, constitutional law. And that's where the Supreme Court and federal courts come into play. Written law. Written law are all of those things that are written down. Those laws we know that are passed by Congress, that are actively enforced by our state. Those are those laws that are written down and we know what they are. They might be changed over time and they let us know about those changes. Those are not hid from us, okay? The other is the unwritten law, which most of you probably don't think about or even know exist. But it's based on a Latin term, stare decisis, all right? So this means let the decision stand. So because written law, you can't create a law that will work for everything. Right? People do crazy things that aren't always written into law. So because crimes and issues can be so weird and different, that we have this unwritten law. All right, and it comes from a Latin term, and it's based in English common law. Right, we were an English colony at one point, so that shouldn't be a shocking fact either. So basically, judges follow precedent. Precedent, if you don't know what it means, precedent is something that comes before. So comes before where we're at now. So for example, George Washington stepping down after 2 terms, and he was setting a precedent when he did that. He wanted to set an example. So basically, precedent is basically an example. So judges follow previous examples when they're trying to interpret, if laws are broken or interpret cases. So basically, if there's a court case that deals with a similar thing back in 1950, right? So let's say some high schoolers run over 25 stop signs and outrun the police. Weird law or weird crime, unique crime. Maybe there's not an identical law in the books for that, but there was a case back in 1950 about the same kind of thing. The judge would look at that case and use that example or precedent in how they're deciding the current case with those high schoolers. So basically, using previous examples to interpret law and seek justice. That is what unwritten law is. Sorry for that complicated spiel. So the court system. Federal court system comprises 2 types of courts. You have constitutional courts and legislative courts. So first, we're going to talk about constitutional courts. The legislative branch has the ability to, so Article 3 of the Constitution established, right, constitutional courts, Supreme Court, or authorize Congress to establish them. So Congress has the ability to establish federal courts. Legislative courts are set up by Congress. We'll talk about those in a minute. So district courts. So there's 3 levels. If you want to write this down, that would probably help you. So there's 3 levels of courts. The lowest are the district courts. The district courts, there are 94 district courts throughout the country. So basically, it's an area of land that is determined to be a district court. Okay, they're districts. As you can imagine, there's going to be more district courts in areas that are heavily populated. Like New York City probably has their own court because there's so many people there. When you can probably, lump Idaho, Montana, Wyoming all together, if that makes sense. So these district courts are the lowest level. Right? So that's where you first go to have your case heard. So there's 2 types of juries in these district courts. You first have a grand jury. This grand jury it has 16 to 23 people on it, right? If the grand jury thinks that the defendant is probably guilty, it issues an indictment against the defendant, all right? So that is the first step. The second step is after the grand jury, right? Grand jury has more people, 16 to 23 people. The second phase of the trial begins, and you have a petit jury. Petit means small. Petit jury of 6 to 12 people, right? And they then listen and hear the case. When they make their decision, that is the final guilty or not guilty verdict. All right, and that is in a district court. You have the grand jury first, and then the petit jury. The Court of Appeals or the Appellate Court, these are circuit courts. So the first level are district courts. Second level, these are federal courts here. You have district courts, then you have the circuit courts, which are appellate or appeals courts, and then you have the Supreme Court, okay? So Court of Appeals are never going to be original jurisdiction courts. They are going to be appellate jurisdiction courts because you're appealing to them. There are only 13 appellate courts in the country, and they handle over 40,000 cases a year. All right, so that's all I'm basically going to say on that. That's that, right? Court of Appeals, that's where you go to appeal the decision if you're not happy with the original decision. Legislative courts, these are courts created by Congress for a specific purpose. These courts have narrowly defined jurisdiction, which means they focus on just one thing, right? And that's basically all they focus on. Because if criminal courts, they can deal with basically any crime. These legislative courts are made by Congress for a specific purpose. So in the second paragraph on slide 24, for example, the Court of Military Appeals, that is a very specific court. It only deals with military-based appellate cases, right? So cases being appealed. You also have U.S. Tax Court. Once again, if you mess with your taxes, you do something illegal, you'll have to go to tax court. That is a very specific court. What else? I think that's all they also have courts that deal with territories such as Puerto Rico, Guam, Virgin Islands. So they make those courts to deal with certain issues. It helps everything run a little bit smoother, because if our normal courts had to specialize in military law or tax law, that's really difficult to do, okay? And because there aren't as many tax violations probably as crimes throughout the year, it helps break up the burden. State courts. State courts follow a very similar model to the federal system, right? The Judiciary Act of 1789 created the three-tiered approach that both use, right? So states use systems where they have lower courts, such as local trial courts, then they go to intermediate appellate courts, and then they lastly they end in the state Supreme Court. So basically, what states call their courts differ, but they're the same thing. You have the lowest level, you have an appeals level, so the appeals level is always in the middle. Appeals level courts are always in the middle, and then you have the Supreme Court, the state Supreme Court. So lowest level courts, so those local courts where you go if you break a local law, like in Newark, then you could go to appeals court for the state, and then you'd go all the way to the state Supreme Court. And if something happened with the state Supreme Court, you could go to the United States Supreme Court. So same three-tier system, it's just different on how they call it, what they call the court. So the federal system, you have district, circuit, and state and Supreme Court, and states it can be local, appellate, and then state Supreme Court. So same structure, just different names. Judicial appointments. You should all know that the only person that can appoint federal judges, so those are judges in district courts, circuit courts, and the Supreme Court, is the president. The president's the only body that can do that, but it's not automatic. It has to be then approved by which branch? Or not which branch, but part of which branch? The Senate. The Senate has to approve every presidential judicial appointment. I'm trying to think. Reagan actually had appointed, Ronald Reagan, he appointed the most federal judges at 402 during his 8-year stint as president. Trump, I believe, he's in the 150s, so he's appointed about 150 or so. He has a chance to get to that 400 mark, but he's probably not going to get there. We'll see if he gets if he gets elected to another term, he might be able to, but it's still unlikely he'll be able to appoint that many. Obama had, I believe, in the 300s in appointments. Chief Justice, basically, and this video here is good. It's the actual current Chief Justice of the United States, John Roberts, who Trump actually appointed. Here answering some questions. So the Chief Justice, they run the Supreme Court. They are the top dog in the Supreme Court. Then they have a couple other responsibilities. In impeachment hearings, they are basically the judge in the impeachment hearings. They make sure everybody gets along and everything is legal being done. Everything that's done is legal. They also administer the oath of office when presidents are sworn in. So they read, they make the president do the oath or whatever they do. that's it on that. Some notable judges, you got Thurgood Marshall, you have Sandra Day O'Connor, who was the first woman justice. A couple notables there. Slide 30, I do not want you to do this activity. Skip the activity titled The Court System on slide 30 in the tutorial. So now we have two different ideas here, or theories. You have judicial activism and judicial restraint. Judicial restraint is pretty, restraining from doing something is trying to keep yourself from doing something. In activism, you're becoming, the root there is active, right? You're becoming active and you're doing something, right? You're being proactive. So restraint's holding back. Activism is trying to set an example for the future, get things moving, be positive, progressive. So judicial restraint in the second paragraph there is a reluctance. Basically, the Supreme Court has been reluctant to overturn decisions by either the executive branch or the legislative branch. So if a Supreme Court's being, if they're adhering to judicial restraint, that means they're reluctant in overturning decisions by either the legislative or executive branch. Activism is the complete opposite. Judicial activism, this is a picture on slide 32 of not John Marshall, but Earl Warren. Warren served from 53 to 69 as Chief Justice. He investigated, the Warren Commission investigated JFK's assassination. Very instrumental Chief Justice. A lot of civil rights, great civil rights successes happened under Warren. So under Warren, it was a very judicial activism was followed. That was the idea he believed in. So basically, these are decisions. Judicial activism are decisions that set an example for the other branches to follow. For example, Brown versus the Board of Education, right? That was a progressive decision, right? They ruled that segregated educational facilities are inherently unequal and will never be okay, right? So that when they struck down, right, that law is unconstitutional, that set the precedent or example for the other branches, right? Whether that be the president, using the National Guard to enforce integration, right? Or the legislative branch passing laws about integration, that started, right, the snowball, right, rolling down the hill. All right, so these are, in the civil rights, a lot of civil rights successes happen under the Warren Court, like I've already said, and that is judicial activism. It talks a little bit about this, a little bit more about the Warren Court on slide 33. Okay, so the Supreme Court hears a tiny percentage of the cases that are presented to it every year. They hear between 80 and 150 cases. They have over 7,000 petitions for them to hear cases throughout the year, and they only choose 80 to 150, right? There are three criteria at the bottom on slide 35 that make it more likely that the Supreme Court is going to hear a case. Number one, two lower courts have come to different decisions about the case. So if the district court has one verdict, the appellate court has a different verdict, then the Supreme Court might look at it because obviously judges are not agreeing on the case. Second, a lower court's decision conflicts with an existing Supreme Court ruling. So if there's already a Supreme Court ruling or precedent that already happened before, in a lower court, let's say an appeals court, a circuit court, issues a decision that violates that precedent, Supreme Court might look into it. Third, the decision has significance beyond the parties in the case. So, for example, Brown versus the Board, desegregating education had a significance beyond just Brown versus the Board of Topeka, Kansas. It had a I just hit my lamp. It had a effect on the whole United States, not just Kansas, the entire United States. So that is an example where, you know, for the common good, the Supreme Court will hear a case. A minimum of at least 4 justices has to agree to hear a case if they're going to hear it. If they don't hear it, they can just deny it flat out. That doesn't mean they don't agree with it, but they just can't hear it or they don't want to hear it. Or they can remand a case. If they remand a case, remand, R-E-M-A-N-D, that means they send it back to the court it came from with instructions to review it and review the judgment that they made on that. Okay, so basically they say, hey, you didn't do such a good job. You need to, you know, do your homework and research this case a little bit more. All right. So deciding cases. So when in session, they're not in session a whole year. They hear arguments for 2 to 3 cases a day, 3 days a week. That schedule will differ based on the Chief Justice and things they have to do. Like, so that's basically, there's 9 Supreme Court justices. You should remember that. For a decision, there has to be, you know, it's obviously going to be a majority. You know, they're going to vote to affirm or deny the decision. So it's either going to be 5 to 4, right? It can't be 4 and 4. I mean, there's going to be an odd number, right? So if the majority wins, they write the majority opinion, and then the minority has to write the minority opinion. The majority opinion is the precedent used for cases later on. That is what is saved into basically history. The history books, the precedent. So Marbury versus Madison, the majority opinion was written, and that's what we learn about. The same will be said 100 years from now, okay? And this is one of the meeting rooms, the picture on slide 37 in the United States Supreme Court building. It's a good video to end out the slides there. And lastly, implementing Supreme Court decisions. So the Supreme Court doesn't have a police force or an army they have at their disposal to implement all of their laws, right? They interpret the law and say if things are constitutional or not, which are very, very important, but they can't, you know, make people follow the law. That is the executive branches and the legislative branch to a certain extent. Those are their roles. The executive branch is the enforcer. They enforce the law. So if you recognize this picture here, I believe I showed this to you in class on slide 39, that is George Wallace at the University of Alabama. He is preventing the, this is the year 1963, preventing 2 African-American students, Vivian Malone and James Hood, from enrolling in the University of Alabama. Until 1963, University of Alabama was completely segregated. Okay, so one of the biggest football schools in the country, and you know, they're always in the news for sports, they were segregated all the way until 1963. But even though the Brown versus the Board of Education decision, which was a Supreme Court decision, was passed 10 years or 9 years earlier, the University of Alabama was still segregated. How's that going to happen? So because of his stubbornness, John F. Kennedy ordered the National Guard to forcibly desegregate the College of Alabama. University of Alabama. So he used his executive privilege as the commander-in-chief to order and use the National Guard to enforce the law. All right, so that is an example of how Supreme Court justice or Supreme Court decisions are implemented. They have to be implemented by either the legislative branch or the executive branch, because the judicial branch can't do it. All right, this the last activity I think is great. It has you look at Plessy versus Ferguson, which is, you know, that legalized segregation back in 1896. It said that separate but equal was okay. So it has you look at that, and it also has you look at Gideon versus Wainwright, which is another case we studied, and that's all about the Sixth Amendment. Florida denied Gideon his right to a lawyer. He couldn't afford one. They denied him one. Went to the Supreme Court. They ruled in favor of Gideon that he had to have a lawyer. Florida had to provide him one under the Sixth Amendment, Sixth and 14th Amendment. So both of these are great. Take your time, go through this, do some research. I know you don't have that much more to do. So take some time, go through this, learn something, all right? Because we've talked about both those cases in depth in class. All right, that's it. You get your, on slide 42, your star of completion. Congrats, you ended it. Alrighty. So I hope that was, helpful, right? Probably this was just, I sound like a broken record at this point in regard to all the different branches, because we've talked about it so much. Once again, if you need anything, let me know. Message me on Plato, email me. I'm always here to help you guys. So until next week, get your work done. Catch you later. All right.